Can you ever forgive your mother for secretly sleeping with your husband? This isn't just betrayal, it's a kind of love that breaks all the rules. It starts with a look you weren't supposed to return, and ends with a kiss you can never forget. Take a breath and settle in. What you're about to hear might change the way you think about loyalty, love, and the lines people should never cross. Welcome, everyone, to Unexpected Stories, where we don't just tell stories, we open doors most people keep closed. Some stories cut deep, some make you question your own beliefs. This is one of them. Evan, 25, never imagined that a twist in fate would unravel his quiet, stable life. He was just a regular guy in a familiar town, where nothing really changed. His days were filled with routine work at a small marketing firm downtown, weekends with takeout, the same faces at the same coffee shops, the same cracked sidewalks he'd known since childhood, a beat-up Honda, a modest apartment. A simple life, and he liked it that way. Everything shifted when Jessica returned. They had gone to high school together, but back then, she was the one everyone noticed, bright, charming, laughing in the halls while Evan sat in the back of the class with his notebook and headphones. But then, one ordinary evening at the grocery store, they both reached for the last carton of mint chocolate chip. Their hands touched. They laughed. That night turned into hours of talking in the parking lot. From casual coffees to slow Sunday walks, the connection blossomed fast. Within 2 years, they were engaged. Jessica had this light about her, something that made life feel warmer, clearer. She wasn't complicated. She listened. She smiled with her whole face. "You make me feel like home," Evan told her one afternoon in the park. She smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "Same here?" And her family? They seemed perfect too. Her mom, Laura, was polished but warm. The kind of woman you'd see in a coffee commercial, always graceful, always composed. She had actually been Evan's high school English teacher. Funny, isn't it? Back then, she was the only teacher who ever seemed to truly see him. She'd talk to him after class about literature, obscure films, quiet things most others overlooked. Now, years later, she welcomed him back into her world, not as a student, but as her daughter's fiance. Laura would often pull Evan aside during family visits, not in a suspicious way, but gently, like she was checking in on an old friend. He never thought much of it. He respected her, admired her, maybe even felt safe with her. The way she spoke so softly, asked thoughtful questions, made him feel like his words mattered. One night, after a cozy family dinner, Laura and Evan sat beneath twinkling string lights in the backyard. She cradled a glass of wine in her hand, her eyes soft with something unspoken. "Jessica's lucky," she said, watching the wind stir the trees. Evan didn't know what to say. He just nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze long after the moment passed. At the time, Evan didn't know he had stepped onto a path one paved with glances, silences, and truths that neither of them was ready to name. That quiet moment became the first crack in a wall he never knew existed. Jessica always spoke of her family with pride. Sunday dinners, matching pajamas at Christmas, inside jokes and laughter that echoed through generations. But those images began to distort one quiet Saturday afternoon. Laura called. Her voice was soft, maybe too soft. "Can I see you? Just to talk." Her tone carried a heaviness he couldn't quite place. They met at a cafe tucked away from the usual crowd. She chose a table in the corner, away from the noise. She wore a simple coat, hair pulled back, a bare face that made her look fragile, almost tired. When Evan arrived, she smiled, but something in her eyes was far from calm. "Thanks for coming," she said, wrapping her hands around a mug. "I should have told you sooner, but we didn't want Jessica to know. James and I, we've been separated for years." Evan blinked. "What?" he said, stunned. But at the party he was joking, drinking like everything was fine. Lavra looked out the window, her voice nearly breaking. We've kept up the image for Jessica. She always saw us as her rock. We didn't want to shake that. Evan nodded slowly, his chest tightening with confusion and a strange sympathy. He couldn't explain it, but her trust telling him this felt significant. It made him feel seen again. Important somehow. The way she looked at him, it wasn't maternal. It wasn't entirely innocent. But it wasn't overt either. As they left the cafe, Lavra touched his arm gently. Thank you for listening. It means more than you know. Then she walked away, her figure dissolving into the evening mist. Evan stood there, still, unsure of what had just passed between them. At the next family dinner, everything looked normal. Jessica laughed with her dad. Lavra served roast chicken and mashed potatoes, poured wine like always. But only Evan knew the truth. Only he could see the cracks behind her smile. And that changed everything. After dinner, Jessica helped her dad upstairs with some photo albums. Evan stayed behind to help Lavra with dishes. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the warm kitchen, the sound of water and clinking plates filling the silence. The food was great, Evan murmured. Thanks, Lavra said. It's the same roast I make every holiday. Silence again. He added, I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. She looked at him quietly. That comforts me, she said. Their eyes met. Just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Something shifted. Days passed. Then came the first message. Hope your meeting went well today. Simple. Then a photo of a book. Then a poem. Then a quote. Nothing inappropriate. But not entirely appropriate, either. One evening, with Jessica out visiting a friend, Evan sat in his apartment rereading Laura's latest message. It's chilly today. Made tea and remembered when we read Frost in class. That poem still gets to me, he smiled. Nothing gold can stay, she used to say, her voice quiet but certain. He replied, I remember. It's truer than ever. When had this become so familiar? So comforting? It wasn't passion. It wasn't overt. It was something quieter, something more dangerous. A slow unraveling of boundaries, one text at a time. And Lavra, she seemed to need him too, for support, for understanding, for something that neither of them dared name yet, and that question unspoken, but undeniable, began to rise inside Evan. Is this still just a family relationship? Or have we already crossed the line? Rachel returned to town in early spring, just as Jessica and Evan were getting engaged. Evan remembered Rachel as a smart, sharp girl with short, neatly cropped brown hair, who always looked older than her years. She had moved to Seattle a few years earlier to pursue a career in interior design, and only came back to visit her family occasionally. But to Jessica, Rachel was more than just a best friend. She was like a big sister. They had grown up together, shared their secrets, and Jessica hadn't said, if anyone knows me better than I do, it's Rachel. It was a light rain on the morning. Rachel arrived at Jessica's house. Evan arrived early to help set up the patio table, and unexpectedly met Rachel in the driveway. She smiled and shook his hand. Finally met the man who made Jessica skip Seattle, she joked. Rachel's voice was confident, but her eyes seemed to red heme with every breath. All morning, Rachel watched, not too blatantly, not too clearly, but enough for Evan to notice. She noted every glance he gave Jessica, every polite word he said to Laura, and especially the moment Laura touched Evan's shoulder lightly when she handed him a cup of tea. No one else noticed, but Rachel did. As the group prepared lunch in the kitchen, Rachel leaned over to Evan, a glass of water in her hand. You and her mother are close. She said, her voice not entirely likelier if it was sarcasm or curiosity. Evan paused before replying, she's a very nice person, and she used to be my teacher. His answer was too perfect, too quick, and therefore too suspicious. Rachel just smiled, saying nothing more. But a spark of caution had just been lit in her eyes. The following week, Rachel took the initiative to ask Evan out for coffee, saying she wanted to get to know Jessica's future partner better. Evan agreed, though he wasn't entirely comfortable with it. They met at a small cafe where the light fell on the wood eatables, creating an intimate atmosphere. Rachel didn't beat around the bush. Jessica said, "You were kind, steady, a little quiet, but I've been friends with her long enough to know when she idealizes someone." She looked Evan straight in the eye, adding slowly, "Is there something you're hiding?" Evan took a sip of coffee, keeping his composure. "I love Jessica, and I'm not fitting anything," he said, trying to keep his voice even. Rachel nodded as if accepting the answer, but not entirely believing it. She pulled out her phone, opening a blurry photo taken from behind, clearly showing Evan and Lavra sitting in a cafe, heads close together, expressions pensive. "I wasn't stalking, but a friend of mine happened to take a picture of you two. It looked like you were sharing something intimate," Rachel said, setting the phone down on the table, her gaze razor sharp. Evan felt the blood rush to his face. Not because he'd been caught, but because he knew the photo was from the afternoon Lavra had revealed her divorce secret. A real moment, but also one filled with misunderstanding. He lowered his voice. "Lavra, trust me, she just needs someone to listen." "Not Jessica?" Rachel asked, tilting her head. "Where is she?" "She's her daughter, your lover. If she needed someone to talk to, why you?" Her voice was low, but heavy, tall. Evan fell silent. Not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he was about to say sounded like an excuse. Rachel looked at him for a moment longer, then stood up. Before she left, she said softly but firmly, "I don't know what's going on between you and Lavra, but if you hurt Jessica, I'll be the first to make you regret it." The words stabbed into Evan's mind, not as a threat, but as a mirror he was forced to look into. In the days that followed, he began to have more trouble sleeping. Laura's texts, though harmless, were suddenly heavy. Jessica's eyes, so gentle and loving, now made him feel more guilty than comforted. Since his meeting with Rachel, Evan couldn't look at Lavra without seeing Rachel's suspicious eyes in his mind. The worst part wasn't that Rachel knew. It was that she was right. Thomas was the kind-of guy everyone liked, not because he always knew what to say, but because he knew when not to say anything. Evan's longtime colleague at the small marketing firm in town. Thomas wasn't bull funny at the right times and blunt. Evan had always seen him as a kind of older brother, one who had been through more, who had been broken, who had strayed, who had come back to himself. Late one afternoon after work, Evan sat in front of his computer, unable to get a word in. Thomas came over, two sodas in his hands, and held one out to Evan. "You look like you've read the entire Bible," he joked, sitting down in that chair across from him. Evan smiled wryly, but didn't answer. Thomas watched his friend in silence for a moment. Stressed about the wedding again, he asked, his voice calm. Eva nodded slowly, then sighed. "Not exactly. But it's related," he said, still staring at the screen. "Want to talk?" Thomas asked, opening his soda and letting it slightly. Evan hesitated, then began to tell not the whole thing. Now to paint a blurry picture of the long nights he couldn't sleep, of Lavra, of Rachel, and the warning prickling at his conscience. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Evan stopped, he nodded, setting the soda down. "You're walking close to the edge, Evan," he said slowly. "And the scary thing isn't falling. It's wanting to fall." Evan was silent. The words felt like a silent punch to the chest. "She's unlike anyone else," he said softly, looking out the window at the sunset, tinting the roofs across the street. "When I'm with her, I feel better, heard, seen." Thomas didn't lie, nor did he judge. "I know I was like you," he said, his eyes drifting to a distant memory. 10 years ago, I fell in love with a married woman. She was smart, sweet, and saw things in me that my wife at the time didn't know." He paused, We didn't do anything. We just sticked. We shared until one day I realized I was in love with someone I wasn't allowed to love. What did you do? Evan asked, sounding afraid of the answer. I stopped, Thomas said. Not because I was strong. I knew I would lose more than I would gain. If I continued. He looked straight at Evan. You think Laura needs you, but you really need what? She represents the validation you never had. Evan sat still. Thomas continued, his voice lower. The heart is deceptive, Evan, especially when it's so close to being. Understood, but understanding doesn't mean compatibility. And compatibility doesn't mean you should. In that moment, Evan felt his heart slow, not because he had found a way out, but because he realized how far he had strayed without knowing it. I don't know what I have control over, he admitted. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. You still have control over one thing, your choices. Don't let yourself be the man who misses someone while hurting someone else, because he can't be true to himself. Evan didn't answer, but he understood. And understanding is always the first step, even if it's a steep hill of letting go. Maggie first appeared in Evan's life by accident, as most important people do. She was a barista at the small coffee shop near Evan's office, where he often stopped by on lazy afternoons. Not strikingly pretty like Jessica, nor elegant like Laura. But Maggie had a special stillness like a lake when the wind was calm. The first time they actually talked was on a lightly rainy afternoon. Evan sat at his usual table, tapping away at his phone, his heart aching as he read a text message from Laura. I dreamed about you last night. Evan, we didn't say anything in the dream. We just sat together and that was enough. Evan didn't know how to respond. Every word carried consequences. That's when Maggie sat down a cup of coffee in front of him and asked softly, Is this coffee moderately bitter? He looked up surprised. She chuckled. I've been watching you drink it for the past 3 weeks. They laughed, and so it began. Evan stayed longer after that. Maggie didn't say much. She usually just wiped down the counter, made the drinks, and sat in the chair by the window reading. But the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that people have when they have nothing to prove to each other. One day, Evan asked, Have you ever had to choose between what's right and what makes you feel alive? Maggie looked at him for a moment, then closed the book. I cheated, she said bluntly. To a close friend. The answer made Evan pause, not because it was shocking, but because it was so true. He was my friend's boyfriend from college. She loved him, but he loved me. Maggie continued, her voice unwavering, but her eyes seemed to be looking back at an old wound. I didn't do anything wrong physically, but I didn't stop when it knew I should. Evan swallowed. And how did it end? He asked. My friend found out, Maggie said, looking out the rain-stained window. She broke up with us both. He left out of guilt. And I lost a friend and an image of myself that I was so proud of. There was silence. Then Maggie spoke softly like a whisper through the rain. Betrayal isn't always wrong. But the bad thing is the heart often feels it at the wrong time. Evan felt his chest grow heavier. So, did you ever forgive yourself? He asked. Maggie shook her head. Not completely. But I learned not to let that mistake become part of who I am. I learned to stop sooner than later. The words stuck with Evan all that evening. He went home, opened his phone, intended to type a few words to Laura, and then deleted them. That night, he dreamed that he was standing between 2 forests, one green, one ablaze, and he stood in the middle, not daring to move either way. Maggie didn't know it, but it was her calm story that stirred something deep inside Evan. Not judgment, but awareness. Because sometimes the person who helps us turn around isn't a lover, not a friend, but a stranger who tells us a truth we've been avoiding for a long time. It was a gray Saturday morning, and the coffee shop on the edge of town was quieter than usual. Rachel had asked Evan to come here in a light tone via text message. Just some coffee, no big deal. But Evan knew people like Rachel never did anything. No big deal. He walked into the cafe and found her sitting at a table in the corner, back straight, stirring her coffee as if spinning the world around on a silver spoon. Evan sat down, smiling politely. Still like sitting by the window, heist, trying to sound casual. Rachel laughed softly. Still like watching people go by without knowing you're watching them, she said, tilting her head. Like you're trying to be casual. Evan tried to respond with a joke, but Rachel put her phone down on the table. On the screen were texts between him and Lavra. Nothing too intimate, but definitely not the kind of thing a future son-in-law should say to his mother-in-law. I don't care how I got this, she said before he could ask. What I want to know is how would Jessica react if she saw it? Evan felt his stomach tighten. Sweat was pouring out of him, though the cafe was not hot. He reached for the glass of water in front of him, but didn't drink. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice low. No, Rachel said, her eyes never leaving his. I'm giving you a chance to do the right thing. She leaned back in her chair. You think you love Jessica, but the way you look at Lavra, the way you text like you're sharing a world that's not normal. Evan bowed his head, his fingers twirling the napkin on the table. Laura's lonely. She needs someone to share it with. I never thought. You never thought or didn't dare admit it. Rachel interrupted, her voice soft but sharp. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping softly on the eaves. Inside, Evan sat as if he were melting into the air. Rachel's question, so direct, non-judgmental, yet so evasive, had touched the realest part of him. At the same time, somewhere else, Laura was standing by the kitchen window holding her phone, but not texting. She had a feeling, the fear that always arose whenever Rachel was around. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, her phone beeped with a text message from an unknown number. You should teach your daughter less. Teach yourself more. The pretender will be exposed soon. Lavra read the message over and over again, her hands shaking slightly. The wind outside whistled through the trees. Inside her heart, a storm was brewing. That evening, James stopped by Laura's house to deliver some insurance papers. He had always been like that, calm, punctual, polite. Even after the divorce, Laura invited him in and made him a cup of ginger tea. They sat in the living room, the yellow light casting shadows on the walls. Silence filled the room until James put down his cup and said without beating around the bush, Rachel called me. Lavra looked up at him. I know, she said softly. I go anonymous messages too. James nodded slowly. I didn't come here to blame you, he said, his voice calm. I just wanted to ask you a question, Lavra. He sat up straight, his eyes still. Soft, but deep as an ancient well. If you're still feeling Evan, you should stop. Not because you're wrong, but because you're going to hurt people. Lavra pursed her lips, her eyes glistening. I don't know how far it's gone, she whispered. It's just he makes me feel seen. I haven't been seen in a long time, James. James didn't respond. He just looked at her for a long time, you understand? And that's why I don't blame you, he said. But Lavra, our daughter, she deserves a beginning that isn't covered by what we dare not let go of. His words were like a light stab, not painful, but leaving a scar when pulled out. Lavra burst into tears. Not loudly, just tears silently sliding down her wrinkled cheeks, carrying the years she had spent trying to be a wife, a mother, a strong woman in a house devoid of love. James stood up, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. I won't interfere, he said. But if you choose to continue, then accept what comes. And if you choose to stop, do it now before it's too late. When he left, Lavra was still sitting there, her eyes red and staring into space. Outside, the rain had stopped, but inside her, the storm had just begun. It was a peaceful evening, at least on the surface. Jessica had an old friend meeting a group of college friends she hadn't seen in over 3 years. Evan was invited to come along, but he declined, citing work. Jessica didn't press her. She just put her hand on his shoulder, said softly, "Don't work." Too late, and walked out the door, leaving a faint scent of perfume in the air. Evan sat in the living room for a moment, then stood up, grabbed his phone. His hand scrawled through the messages, stopping at Laura's name. He didn't text, just looked. But as if only an afterthought, he was holding the car keys. Laura opened the door when Evan arrived. She was wearing a thin cream-colored sweater, her hair loose, her face slightly surprised. "You came unannounced?" she asked. Evan just nodded, not explaining. Something was driving his gaze. No reason, no plan. Laura watched him for a few more seconds, then stepped aside, opening the door wider. The house was quiet. James wasn't there. Everything seemed to be quiet for a moment that couldn't be returned. They sat on the sofa, just fair enough apart, but not far enough to stop the emotions from surging. Evan didn't know who started it. Maybe it was him when his eyes lingered on her face for too long. Or maybe it was Laura when her hand came to his shoulder in reflex like it had always done, but didn't pull away this time. "You shouldn't be here," Evan whispered. "I know," Laura said, her eyes not avoiding his, "but you came anyway." The silence fell like a curtain, and then there was no distance. Evan leaned forward, and his lips met hers lightly, hesitantly, but clearly enough to break the fragile barrier they had maintained all this time. Laura didn't push him away. Instead, she closed her eyes as if letting the emotions take over. The kiss lasted longer than it should have. Evan's hands tightened around Laura's waist, and she raised her hands to his face, a gesture that was no longer instinctive for a future mother-in-law. In that moment, they were no longer Evan and Laura. They were two lonely souls who had found each other in the darkness they had tried to deny. They didn't go any further, but what had happened was enough. Enough to make it impossible to pretend to be friends or family, or anything but a secret. That night, Jessica came home earlier than she had expected. She walked into the house, hung her coat on a hook, and paused when she saw Evan's phone lying open. On the table, the screen still lit. A new message appeared at the top. "Thanks for coming. I'm still shaking." "Laura," she read it over and over. Her heart was pounding. Then she opened the old text messages, scrolling through the gentle but intimate conversations, questions that went beyond politeness, emotional exchanges. She didn't say anything. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there for a long time. The next morning when Evan woke up, Jessica was sitting at the dining table, holding a cup of coffee. She looked at him with an unreadable gaze. "What were you saying to my mom?" she asked, her voice low but sharp as a thin blade. Evan stammered, his eyes avoiding her. We were just talking. She's been sad lately, I know." Jessica interrupted, her eyes still fixed. "But I don't think a sad person would text her daughter's boyfriend." "I'm still shaking after 10 p.m., Evan couldn't answer. The air in the room was so thick, it felt like a single movement could cause everything to fall apart. Jessica stood up, clearing the cups like a robot. "I'm staying at Rachel's for a few days," she said, her voice cold. "Don't call, don't text. I need to think." As the door closed behind her, Evan stood still. The space around him felt as if it had lost its gravity, so light that he felt like he was about to dissolve into thin air. The cafe was empty that afternoon. It was about to rain, the clouds low and heavy. Evan walked in, and his shoulder slumped, as if he were carrying the winter on his back. Maggie was wiping down a table inside. When she saw him, she wasn't surprised. She just nodded and gestured to the table by the window, the one he usually sat at. Evan sat down, his hands clasped together. After a moment, Maggie placed a cup of hot coffee in front of him without asking what he wanted. "You need this," she sighed, and sat down across from him. They were silent for a long time, only the ticking of the clock and the lingering scent of coffee in the air. Finally, Evan spoke. Have you ever betrayed someone and regretted it so much that you couldn't breathe? The question came out as if he had held it in his chest for so long that it couldn't stay there any longer. Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked at him, her eyes not judging, only patient. Then she said, "Betray isn't always an act. Sometimes it's letting someone trust you when you're not the person they trust anymore." Evan bowed his head, his eyes glistening. "I lost her. Not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't dare choose." He spoke almost to himself. "I let it all flow. I thought I could keep both." Maggie nodded. "We always think we're the exception, the only ones who can walk between the two shores without getting wet. But the water still seeps through our shoes. And when we look back, there's no dry way back." Tears began to slide from Evan's eye excellently, without a sob, just heavy drops that seemed to tear at the tough shell he wore. Maggie said nothing more. She just pulled out a tissue, set it on the table, and left him alone with his sadness. That evening, when Evan returned to his apartment, now Jessica free, his phone rang. It was Thomas. His voice was as flat as ever, but deeper. "I heard from Rachel," Thomas said. It's not easy to hear that from someone else. Evan didn't deny it, didn't defend himself. "I was wrong," he said softly. "I thought I could control it. But I couldn't," Thomas sighed. "You have Tobe strong and clear, Evan. You can't have two souls. One trying to hold on to Jessica, one dreaming of Lavra. It'll tear you in two, and no one survives being torn in two. Jessica doesn't want to see me anymore," Evan whispered. "And I didn't think she'd ever forgive me." Thomas paused. "Some mistakes can't be undone, but you can learn from them and not let them happen again. You don't need forgiveness to do the right thing. You just need to resolve not to let that mistake define the rest of your life." The call ended. Evan sat alone in the dark, the room emptier than ever. But in that silence, something began. Not forgiveness, not liberation, but the first honesty with himself. Lavra stood in front of the bedroom mirror, her hands clasping the straps off her gray sweater. Her face bore the marks of a sleepless night, not of physical fatigue, but of mental restlessness. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jessica's face, a look of quiet disappointment. No anger, no tears, just retreat. That morning, shackled James, she didn't explain why. She just said, "If you have time, I'd like to talk." Her voice was soft, but James, as her husband, as her confidant, knew that something important was waiting. They met at the old house where James used to come to pick up his mail and tend the back garden. Lavra walked in, sat down on a chair, and looked around the familiar now unfamiliar space. James made 2 cups of tea, sat them down, and waited in silence. Jessica knows," Lavra began. Her voice was. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her eyes. "Something died inside her, and I killed it." James nodded slowly. "Rachel told her," he said, not blaming, just confirming. Laura looked at him, her eyes full of regret. "I never thought it would go this far." Evan was a good boy. But I couldn't find my life in the heart of someone who should have been my daughter." James was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What are you going to do?" Lavra took a deep breath. "I'm leaving," she said, "not to run away, to give everyone a breathing space. Jessica needs to be loved without me in the way. Evan needs to learn to move on without being stuck between 2 generations." She looked straight at James. "And I need Tolan to live with myself again, not through someone else's eyes." A moment of silence passed, broken only by the wind blowing through the windows. James finally spoke, his voice quiet. "It's a brave choice, but it will hurt." Lavra nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Every step away from her is a tear in my heart, but maybe that pain is worth it more than losing your child's faith and family." James walked over and sat beside her. He said nothing more, just put his hand on hers, squeezing it gently. Not like an ex-husband, but like a friend. The only one who understood that Sometimes love isn't about holding on, but about knowing when to let go. Outside, the clouds were still thick, but in Laura's heart, the first light of resolution began to creep in. The cafe is almost deserted that afternoon. The sky outside the glass windows was murky, a sign of impending rain. Evan arrived early. He chose the table by the window, the one Laura had sat at when they used to talk. She appeared a short time later, walking slowly, a light brown coat, her hair pulled back into a bun. Her face calm, but her eyes filled with waves she had tried to keep quiet since morning. Evan stood up, pulling out a chair for her, as was his habit. They sat down, saying nothing for a few minutes. Each sipped his drink, as if trying to drink away what could not be said. Finally, it was Laura who spoke. "Do you think if things had been different, we wouldn't be sitting here like this?" Her voice was soft, like smoke hovering between them. Evan nodded, his eyes red. "I think so, but it's not different." He looked straight at her. "I came here to say goodbye, not just to you, to something in me that has gone too far." Laura didn't cry. She just placed her hand on the cooling coffee, as if to hold on to the last bit of warmth. "You're the only one who can see me, really see me," she said softly. "But maybe sometimes being seen doesn't mean being kept." Evan squeezed her hand, taking a deep breath. "We need to stop so Jessica doesn't get hurt anymore." The words were like a stone dropped into a lake, stirring up all the emotions. Laura nodded. "Let's go back to how it was before, if we can." She stood light as a breeze and walked away without looking back. Evan sat still. His hand still felt warm from their last moment together. Jessica stood across the street in Rachel's car. She had seen Evan enter the cafe from afar. And then Laura, no sound, just a series of images. Two people who once played different roles in her heart, now sitting across from each other, like two people sharing a mistake. She didn't go in, didn't need to, just looked for a long time. When Laura stood up and left, Evan sat alone, head bowed. Jessica felt her tears fall. Not big, not rushing, just silent drops sliding down her cheeks. Rachel took her hand gently. "Are you sure you want to say something?" Jessica shook her head. "No, you don't need to ask them anything else." The way they looked at each other and left answered it all. As Evan left the shop, stepping out into the light rain, Jessica opened the car window, calling his name. He paused, turned surprised. "Jess?" She stepped out of the car, walking slowly towards him. The wind blew her hair, her eyes red, but determined. "Do you think it will end without anyone getting hurt?" Evan was silent for a long time. Then he said, "No, but I hope that hurt doesn't kill the good that once was." Jessica added, "I don't hate you, but I need to forget you so that I can keep the part of me that I loved." She turned away, got into the car, and said nothing more. Rachel drove away, and Evan stood there in the rain that was getting heavier. Evan drove slowly down the old road, the windows fogging up. The rain fell steadily, pressing each drop on the glass, as if time itself were shrinking with each moment of life. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew. He couldn't stay in a place where too many memories had overlapped. In the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the coffee shop faded. Maggie stood by the door watching. She didn't wave, didn't smile. Just silent like the last punctuation mark in a long paragraph that the writer was tired of. The narrator's voice rings out quietly. Can people be at peace after an emotional wound so deep? Or do we just learn to live with it? Like learning to live with a scar which every time the weather changes it aches again. The last image is Evan in the car in the rain, eyes looking straight ahead. Not crying, not smiling, but somewhere in his eyes is a very small ray of light, perhaps hope. When the story ends, perhaps the deepest thing that remains is not the mistakes or betrayals, but his silences that each character has to go through on their own, where emotions and morality confront each other in silence. The story of Evan Lavra. Jessica, not just a forbidden love story. It is a breathtaking collision between seemingly simple human needs to beloved, to be understood, to be seen, and the value system imposed by society morality standards roles. When Evan and Lavra cross the line, they not only destroy the relationship between the two, but also trade the peace of a system of familiar people. Thank you for spending your precious time listening to this story until the last seconds. Bueno. Among countless choices you chose to stay, and that is no small thing to us. Each story at Daily Unexpected Stories is told with all the respect for the listener's emotions. We don't just tell stories. We accompany the collisions of life of choices, of things that seem very personal but turn out to be very common. If you see yourself somewhere in this story, or simply love stories that are true, profound, and not afraid to touch the dark corners, please subscribe to the channel. A subscription from you is the motivation for us to continue bringing the next unexpected stories where emotions, ethics, and humanity always intersect at unexpected points. See you in the next episode.